My name's Paul Deis. I've been a model railroader most of my life. My earliest memory is around 4 years old of my dad's Lionel trains. I'm a retired disabled firefighter paramedic. And when I retired from the Morro Bay Fire Department, I went to work for the state of California at the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. And my job was to develop and train people in hazardous materials emergency response. As part of building that set of course materials, I worked closely with the hazmat responders from the Southern Pacific Railroad. They did some really cool things. They built us a 13-car real train derailment that's out at Camp San Luis Obispo. And they also allowed us to train their responders, and they came and helped train the emergency responders from the fire service and hazmat teams. As part of this, I would go on derailments that involved hazardous materials with the Southern Pacific Railroad employees. And what we're going to do today, we're going to look at a real train derailment. It was a fairly significant derailment that occurred in a special place. It was on the Vandenberg Air Force Base, which meant that it was in the middle of nowhere and didn't really impact any communities, but it presented a lot of challenges. And what I want to do is I want to take you through the derailment through the eyes of the emergency responders, give you a little idea of what they have to deal with on an emergency. So a little background on the derailment. Those in California might remember in 1991, we had been in a 7-year drought in California. Well, that ended in March of 91 with 4 days of continuous rain. Heavy rains. So much sometimes you couldn't see across the street. Well, in the middle of these storms at 4:45 in the morning on March 19, 1991, the Southern Pacific freight train was heading from the San Luis Obispo area south, and it was involved in a derailment on Vandenberg Air Force Base. The train had a crew of 2 people, an engineer and a conductor. There were 3 locomotives, 26 freight cars, and 5 of those cars contained hazardous materials. We have a rule in emergency services. It's called the rule of thumb. If you hold your thumb out at arm's length, if you can't hide the problem behind your thumb, you're too close until you figure out what's going on. The first idea on a hazardous materials response is not to bring any victims to the incident. Once you ensure everybody's safety, then you can start to deal with the hazardous materials. So with that in mind, let's take a look, and I'll take you through what we did those days and how an emergency responder would look at this derailment. The first thing you want to know when you respond to a train derailment while you're still at that thumb's distance is, what am I dealing with? And we teach responders there's some different tools you can use to find out what's going on. One of them is called a consist. Consist is paperwork required to be carried by the conductor on the train and carried in the locomotive that lists the consist of the train. What's in what cars? It lists those cars from the front of the train to the rear of the train. It's required that that paperwork be given to emergency responders. Well, we had a problem. In this derailment, the consist got left in the locomotive. The crew was quite shook up, as you'll see from the pictures. Instead, what we got was called a conductor's wheel report. It's similar to a consist, but with a lot less detail. And that caused us some problems as we went on. So this is the opening page of the consist. The top tells you about the braking abilities. Then it lists the locomotives, and then it lists the cars in the train. And if you look down at the 4th car, GADX 81486, it says dangerous, hydrofluosilic acid. Okay, so that's one we want to think about. We go further down and we see a car that says residue, last contained petroleum naphtha. Well, there's a reason they call that residue and not empty. Residue means the car was emptied as far as commercially is reasonable. That's a bunch of words. That means there could be 3% of the product approximately left in the car. Well, do some math. If it's a 30,000 gallon car, you got 3% left of the product in there, you got a lot of product. So when a car says residue, it sometimes can be more dangerous than a full car. Depending on the product, it could be full of very flammable or very toxic gases versus the liquid. So we go a little further down, we have another car, last contained petroleum naphtha. Then we go down, we have anhydrous ammonia. Anhydrous ammonia is one of the problems with the way our Department of Transportation identifies hazardous materials. An anhydrous ammonia car has a green placard that says non-flammable gas. To the untrained person, you'd go, okay, hey, no big deal. Except one breath of anhydrous ammonia and you're dead. Exposure of anhydrous ammonia onto your skin removes the moisture from your skin and turns that part of your body basically into one of those creepy things we see coming out of the graves on Halloween. Anhydrous ammonia in the right concentrations is explosive. So even though it says non-flammable gas, it's actually really bad stuff. We call it triethyl difuranol. Yeah, it's bad stuff. And further down, we have soda ash and lumber and clay and paper products and something that looks like shingles. So we've got a mixed amount of materials in this train, some that we're going to be greatly concerned about. Now that we have an idea of some of the hazards, one of our tasks will be, from a safe distance if possible, find the cars that have bad stuff in them, get an idea from a distance if they still have the stuff in them and what condition those cars are in. And based on that, we can make some choices on protective clothing we have to wear, evacuation areas, and any dangers to the environment. So with that information in hand, we're going to look at the derailment as if we were the first team to suit up and make entry. Because of the anhydrous ammonia cars, the initial entry was done in what's called Level A chemical protective clothing, which is a moon suit. It's the totally encapsulated environment you're in. It's dangerous just to walk down the street wearing this garment, but it will protect you from what's out there that's toxic. It won't protect you from anything flammable, though. It'll actually maybe make you worse. It'll shrink wrap you. The pictures we're going to look at, though, I shot after we had confirmed we had no active environmental leaks that I had to be concerned with. So let's take a look. Another unique thing is where we were. This facility in the picture is called Slick 6. It is Space Launch Complex number 6. And at that time in 91, it had just been decommissioned. It was supposed to be where we were going to launch the space shuttle. That is the closest we could get to the derailment and actually use a cell phone to communicate with the rest of the world. Where the derailment was a pretty rural area, and also an area that for some reason we had to go through 2 checkpoints of airmen with M16s inspecting what we were doing. They wouldn't tell us what was out around the derailment, but there was something there we weren't supposed to tell people about. All the photos you'll see had to be cleared by the Air Force prior to them being shown to anybody. Actually, they took my cameras, they developed the film, and then they gave me the pictures I could have. Here's our first look at the derailment. A big pile of rail cars. Way off in the distance, you can see 2 locomotives. That's where the locomotives stopped. The train was going quite quick, and when it went into emergency, those 2 locomotives still made it all the way down to there. So from this view, we can't tell if we have anything that's leaking, but thinking about the violence of the derailment, we probably have some significantly damaged cars. And we don't know if any of them are going to contain hazardous materials. So we're going to start taking a 360 view and thinking about the hazards. So we know we got hazardous materials out in front of us. But on the right-hand side, you see these power poles. People go, oh, that's just the signal stuff for the railroad. Yeah, it's the signal stuff, but at over 100 volts. And the wires may be damaged, and they could produce a spark. And if we have anything flammable, combustible out there, we could have a problem. We can also see out in the distance some white stuff out in the field. Well, from the paperwork, we know we have soda ash. So maybe that's the soda ash. Another thing we teach responders is look for hints. Look for signs of what something might be. And even from this distance, I can see way out there, looks like the end of 2 tank cars. Don't know what's in them. Don't know what could be in them, except what the consist shows. But it's something to just keep in mind as we go forward. I also see a boxcar that's leaning over, but it's not laying on its side. Let's hope it doesn't decide to move. It is still raining while we're doing most of this, and we don't know yet why the derailment occurred, but we know that as things get wet, things can move, including the derailment. So another thing to be concerned about. We have to stay clear of anything that might suddenly move. As we get a little closer, we see we do have power lines down, so we do have to worry about sparks. That white object in the center, from here, I can tell that is a tank car. Can't tell much more about it, but I can tell it is definitely a tank car. And way off in the distance, I can see a black object with white on it next to that white stuff on the ground. That also looks like a tank car, but it doesn't look quite round anymore. So it may have some kind of significant damage. As we get closer, we can see that that boxcar is pretty precarious on how it is sitting. We're going to stay well clear of that, and we have to consider if it rolls over, what's going to occur? Will it slide down the hill? Will it take the other car with it? Will it cause sparking? Again, if we have any kind of flammable liquids. We know we have combustible residue cars. Well, what does combustible mean? It means in a laboratory setting, it's not easily ignited, but once ignited, burns good. Well, that's in a laboratory. That's not in nature. That's not atomized. So we don't know. That could still be a problem. A little further down, we can see we've got some more cars on their sides. We can see that we still have the power lines. And what we're also doing is we're reporting back via radio every car number we see and whether the car is upright or not and whether it appears to be damaged or not. So someone back at the command post is starting to check the cars off as we find them. Now we're swinging a little wider. We can see on the right-hand side, there's flowing water. So we still have water flowing through the derailment. Again, it's a place where things might suddenly move. Up in the center of the picture, we see that white object. Well, now I can see some things about it that tell me something. One, it's rounded on the end, not flat. That can be indicative of a pressure rail car. The railroad only puts commodities that require a strong car in a pressure car. Pretty much, if it's a pressure car, it has hazardous materials in it. Now we can also see that that white car appears to be sitting up against a black car that has a single dome on top. Again, that is indicative of a pressure rail car. A pressure car means hazardous materials. My first guess is that we may have found our anhydrous ammonia cars, and they look like they've been hit pretty hard. So our concern level continues to grow. As we look a little closer, we can see some things to help us have an idea of what we're looking at. The white car, looking at the shape of it, looking at the amount of stuff piled up against it, I am even more convinced that that's anhydrous ammonia and that that car may have some significant damage as it's laying over on its side. Other cars are on top of it, and it is up against the other, what appears to be a pressure car. So I think I have found my 2 anhydrous ammonia cars, and there's a potential that they have some severe damage. So we're going to keep that in mind as we go around. It's also continuing to rain, but the forecast is for the rain to let up and for it to warm up. Well, why would that be a big deal? It makes life easier. It's not raining. Except as it warms up, pressures increase in containers. We have two potentially significantly damaged anhydrous ammonia cars that we have no way of telling right now if they're just 1 pound per square inch of pressure short of tearing themselves apart. So we really have to be careful and pay attention. We can also see on that gondola up top, there's white stuff all over it, and there's more white stuff off on the right-hand side. Could be soda ash, except to the left of that white tank car, I think I can see a crushed hopper and white stuff on the ground. That would be more likely what soda ash would be carried in. I can't see a car number yet, so I can't confirm or deny that. But it causes me to puzzle, what's the other white stuff? I have it in too many places. So we go further around, we look at the part of the derailment, and there's water flowing below that pile of cars. Well, flowing water means things could move. So again, we're concerned with, is the derailment going to stay where it is? Or are parts of this derailment going to suddenly move? And if they move, will there be a catastrophic release of some product? Now here we can see a culvert and what was a flat car containing wheels laying next to the culvert. What caused this derailment is in this crazy Miracle March rains, some debris had flown down the hillside above this area, including a piece of chain link fence, which had blocked the culvert, which then got covered by debris and then by mud. And this raised embankment became a dam. And behind that dam filled acres of water until it flowed over the top. And when it flowed over the top, it cut a new channel right next to the culvert. You then had a big gap in the roadbed, and you had two rails trying to act as a bridge. As the train came across, the first locomotive made it, stayed upright, stayed on the rails. The second locomotive made it across, but the rear truck derailed. The third locomotive didn't make it, and we'll see pictures of that in a moment. So our problem here again is we have a pile of cars, we have flowing water not going through the culvert, but going through the new waterway that was created as part of the derailment. Well, here we can see a close-up of that white car. There's some more hints in this white car. One, if you can see, there's kind of a curved line that goes around the bottom of the car. What that is usually is in the derailment, the truck, the set of wheels, twisted around and scratched the metal. Well, from this distance, we can't tell, is that gouge deep enough that it may cause cracking? Another thing I can see, and it's a little hard to see in the picture unless you know what you're looking for, but this car had what was called a head shield. A head shield is, after 1983, pressure rail cars containing certain hazardous materials were required to either have a double thickness end on the car, or if it was an existing car, they had to add a layer of steel sitting off the end of the car several inches to give protection from being punctured by the coupler of a car next to it. Well, that's another piece that tells us this is the anhydrous ammonia car. And then if you look carefully right above where the truck would have attached, you could see a little bit of a green diamond. Well, that's that non-flammable placard. And then a little bit of humor, which we love during these kind of situations. If you look on the black car on the right-hand end of the picture, it says, in case of. If you've ever noticed what it'll say on hazardous material cars, in case of emergency, call, and there's an 800 number. That number is for an organization called Chemtrek, who emergency responders can call to get some information. So it's kind of a joke, but yeah, we're in an emergency. Here we can see that crushed hopper. Still can't get a car number on it, but we only had one hopper in the train and it had soda ash. So that's the soda ash sitting under the anhydrous ammonia car, which means the other white stuff, like on the gondola at the top of the picture, I really don't know yet what that is. Doesn't make sense with anything in that conductor's wheel report. And then we can see another car number on the end of that boxcar, which we can then check that one off on the list. We go further around. Now we can see this tank car. It probably doesn't have much in it anymore since it's been torn open like a beer can. That gives you an idea of the forces in a derailment. That's half-inch thick steel that tank car is made out of, and it is just torn open. You can also see a red placard on that car. The red placard is a combustible liquid, which tells us, okay, we found one of our naphtha cars. And chances are it's been raining hard, that there's probably not much naphtha left from the residue in that car. I can also see the end of that anhydrous ammonia car is buried in the mud. Well, that is a point of concern. We could have a bad dent in the end of that car and have it being contained by the car pressing into the mud. So we really have no way of knowing the danger here. You know, it's one thing about a hazardous materials response. If we were to just go home, all hazardous materials incidents will self-mitigate. In other words, they will eventually stabilize either through an explosion, a fire, or just kind of get better on their own. Except that could take a long time. And we can't really do that by walking away from it. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to get this derailment cleaned up and how we're going to deal with this anhydrous ammonia cars. We continue around and we see more of this white stuff. Still don't know what it is, but it's all over the place on the derailment. Keep going down, we can see more of the damage to that car, more of the white stuff. Now as we come around the end of the derailment, we can see again a lot of the white stuff, and we can see this FGE solid gold refrigerator car. This is one that the rumor was there was a load on this train that was consigned to Anheuser-Busch. We couldn't confirm that because we didn't have the consist. So people were wondering, was that a refrigerated car full of beer? Might have been a priority for some people to find that out above everything else. I can also see to the right of that refrigerated car the end of another tank car. Here's another look at that crushed car, and it is leaning up against another tank car that doesn't look like it's in very good shape, and it's also covered in this white stuff. If you look at the end of the car on the left-hand side, it looks like the white stuff is running off the car, but it's not. It's actually solidified. Nothing that we could see in that wheel report told us we should have anything here that should solidify, but we do. Come further down along the derailment, more of the white stuff. You can see how big this pile of cars is. Now we found engine number 3. Locomotive number 3 went over on its side and dug its own trench as it slid to a stop. It was kind of good that it dug that trench because it also tore a hole in its diesel fuel tank. Now, what people don't often think about is if you have a tank truck going down the freeway with a few thousand gallons of diesel fuel and it gets into a wreck and leaks, wow, we got a big emergency. Well, what you got to realize is each locomotive can have 4,000 to 6,000 gallons of diesel fuel. In this case, this tank was ripped open. It dug its own trench, which contained a lot of the fuel, but it also been raining, so a lot of it went to the Great Pacific Dilution Zone. In other words, washed out into the Pacific Ocean. Those that are modeling and want to know what the bottom of a locomotive looks like, here's a picture for you. And you can see up on that tank, there's this long dent. That's where it slid down the rails after it had gotten off the trucks. So it augured in pretty good. There's a lot of forces involved in this derailment. It's really good now thinking about the ride that those 2 crew members in the locomotive must have had. You can understand why, one, they knew they had hazardous materials. They had just been through an e-ticket ride, and they left the consist behind. I can understand why. I'm glad the conductor's wheel report was in the conductor's pocket. Looking back up towards the derailment, that yellow stuff is we had 2 hoppers loaded with corn. If we had had a fire, we might have had popcorn. Now here's another tank car, this one laying on its side. So we need to think this tank car is damaged, and if it has product in it, how do we get the product out? One of the interesting things is on tank cars, they have safety devices. They're designed not to leak if they turn over. The problem with those safety devices, they will actuate when the car is less than upright, usually within 15 degrees of upright, making them difficult to unload. If that car still has any product, we have to upright it prior to unloading it. Here we get a little closer look at that tank car and more of that white stuff. Now we can see the pressure dome or the manway area on that tank car. This picture tells us a few things. In the center of that picture is what's called a one-arm bandit. It's a fill hole for filling that car that has a one-arm closure, and it is not closed correctly. It has been bent by the derailment, and we can see that any product that was in that car, a lot of it is now on the ground. This also tells me this is an acid car. I believe we found our hydrofluorosilicic acid, and the ground is probably saturated with that acid. Maybe not a good place to be standing in sneakers. Now looking back, we can see another tank car. We can check this one off our list. This is what's called a general service or non-pressure tank car, which is good news because with the severity of that dent in the end of the car, if this were a pressure car, it's very likely it would have failed. One of the tools we carry when we're evaluating derailment is called a dent gauge. The dent gauge is used to measure the radius of curvature on a dent. Depending on what year the car was made, is what radius the steel can be expected to withstand without having critical cracks. This dent wouldn't require me to use a dent gauge. If that were a pressure car, it would be surprising that it hadn't failed, but it would be likely to fail. A general service car doesn't apply, but that's an understanding of thinking about the dents in a car may become important later. As we get around the derailment, we see some interesting things here. One, that white car in the center is the other end of that anhydrous ammonia tank car. As we can see, it is buried under other cars. You can also see how the height of this derailment. Oftentimes you see a picture of a derailment and it's like a zigzag of cars laying next to each other on the ground. In this case, as the cars went over the new bridge caused by the washout, the wheels fell off of them and they just started piling on top of each other. To the left of that white car, we can see a black thing going up in the air. That's another tank car that obviously is upside down and probably severely damaged. An odd thing in this derailment, you see the blue and the yellow lines that go through the picture. Those are the primary fiber optic lines for AT&T and MCI for the Western United States. One of the highest priorities on this derailment was to jumper around the derailment with both of those fiber lines because it was costing the railroad excess of $1 million an hour per severed line because we had killed pretty much most of the communications going to the Pacific Ocean that came from the southern part of the United States. It was interesting to see the crews come out and put miles of cable on the ground as a big loop around the derailment. Here's another look at the derailment. Again, it's sticking way up in the air. We're working in really gooey mud. That's a mixture of water, dirt, petroleum naphtha, hydrofluorosilicic acid, and who knows what else. Now, this poor guy in the center of the photo was the OSHA inspector that came out to look at the derailment. He wasn't the smartest safety guy. He walked down there, and that field in front of him, where there was debris, was also a field of mud, and many footprints went up to the field and then walked around it. He chose to walk across it, sunk almost to his waist in this gooey mud, and then fell face forward into it. People came to help him. By the time they were able to extract him from the mud, he was now barefoot because his boots and his socks sunk away in the mud. We helped him back to his vehicle. He left to never return. Probably should have thought a little more about why everybody else walked around that field of mud. It also took away the one outside agency that was here overseeing the derailment. So it left us from the Office of Emergency Services, the railroad employees, and their contractor, and the military to deal with the derailment. Here, looking up again at these cars, we got some of the soda ash. We can see the cars are pretty well buried up against each other. We're really concerned about these anhydrous ammonia cars. We're really concerned because we can't tell how badly they're damaged. You can see here, two of the tank cars kind of smashed into each other. The manway area of one car is stuck into the side of the other car. Here's an upside down, one of the other petroleum naphtha cars. It isn't torn open. However, because it's upside down, its safety relief valve is stuck in the mud. So should there be some reason pressure would be increased in this car, such as if we had a fire impinging on the car, there is no place for that pressure to go. This would be one that would be very worrisome in a fire situation because it most likely would fail in a violent explosion. Fortunately, it's still cool, it's still raining, and we have no fire. Here's another general service tank car upside down. Here's the other end of that black anhydrous ammonia tank car. It is sitting up on top of the white anhydrous ammonia tank car. It's obvious they went through some pretty violent maneuvers to get where they are. Now, as we come back down, we can see this car that's leaning over on its side, partially. It is actually hung up by the coupler. Well, one of our early things that we wanted to deal with is removing this hazard. We could hear it creaking every once in a while as the ground was moving. So they got somebody, a volunteer, hopefully they paid him well for that day, but he took a special high temperature plasma torch, put about a 6-foot extension on it, stood next to the car on the right, reached out, and with that torch, cut the coupler. When he did that, the car on the left rolled down off the side of the hill. The one on the right bounced a good couple feet up into the air and came back down, luckily not on top of him. I don't know what they paid him, but it wasn't enough money. So we get back away from the derailment, kind of a good overview. You see that in the, a little hard to see, but in the foreground is a red piece of what's called barrier tape or danger tape. Normally, you use that to isolate an area so people don't wander into the derailment. In this case, however, it was the opposite. Anyone who wanted to go to where I took this picture from had to have permission to go there from the Native American agent on site, because this derailment was also on top of a historic Native American Chumash Indian burial site. So a lot of what we had to do was to preserve that site, including, instead of bulldozing a road into here to get heavy equipment in, we had to bring in loads of dirt and build a road on top of the existing ground to get heavy equipment in. Here's some of the equipment we brought in to start dealing with the derailment. Again, a view of the dangers we're dealing with here, the height of the derailment, and the conditions we're dealing with. And the sun had finally come out, which, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't necessarily a good thing because we're really worried about those anhydrous ammonia cars. Here's how they cleared the culvert to get the water flowing. If anybody here works for Caltrans, you could probably figure out the joke of all those supervisors watching one guy dig with the shovel. Here's how they dealt with that one locomotive. What they did a lot of work here with is called a side boom. It's a large bulldozer, has a blade on the front, has a huge counterweight on one side and an A-frame on the other side. So for this locomotive, they took 4 of these side booms, picked the locomotive up in the air, raised one side, lowered the other to upright it, set it back on its trucks, came back with one of the other locomotives and towed it away. From what I understand, this locomotive was repaired and put back into service. Here's how we dealt with most of the derailment. We couldn't evaluate those anhydrous ammonia cars until we unburied them. The way we would unbury them is by dragging the other cars off of them. We really couldn't get in easily with the side booms. They would sink in the mud. So we would just have to drag cars out of the way. As you can tell from what protective clothing that gentleman's wearing, we had established what was safe to wear in different parts of the derailment. One of the problems we had with no one standing there from OSHA, as they dragged that car, it slid, hit that pole, and knocked it over. Luckily, didn't hit anyone in the head. Here came our big problem. We eventually got in and dug out the end of that white anhydrous ammonia tank car. What I can see in the picture is right above the stack from that dozer, there's a huge dent. I do not need a dent gauge to evaluate that dent. And this isn't how we found it. They dug down next to the car carefully with an excavator till they were about 2 feet away from it. Then a couple of, again, volunteers went in with hand shovels and dug down. And then something occurred that's a little bit scary. I've been on hundreds of hazardous materials incidents in my career. And one of the things we talk about in the initial safety briefing is what is the emergency signal and what do you do if it sounds? In this case, we were to leave the scene and muster about a mile away down the track. Well, this incident is the only time in all the ones I've ever responded to where somebody sounded the emergency signal. And we all booked it, some running, some slogging along in protective clothing, because when they had dug away with the shovel and a big clod of dirt fell off the end of that car, they could see that they had what we call a critical dent. And there was a high likelihood of that car suddenly failing. So what did we do? We evacuated the site and got the experts together. We talked with people from the Gadex, the company that made the car. We talked with chemists that dealt with anhydrous ammonia. We talked with equipment operators on what we could do. And what was decided is to wait until 2 a.m. 2 a.m. would be when the product in the container should be its coldest, therefore have the least amount of pressure. We would go in with 4 side booms with their operators wearing chemical protective clothing, 1 rigger to direct them, and a 4-person emergency team to rescue in case things went bad. The plan was we would carefully, with the 4 side booms, lift the car into the air, roll it upright, and then stop. Evacuate the scene and wait a while for things to stabilize. Because as you roll the car upright, even if you do it perfectly with the 4 side booms, you could put some torsional stress on the steel and cause it to fail. So we waited about an hour. Then that same people went back in and gently lowered the car back down to where you see it now. Then we were able to bring in tank trucks and unload the car. Again, we couldn't unload it while it was on its side because the valves must be within 15 degrees of upright in order to get any product out through them. So nobody died today because it was nobody's turn to die. But it was a pretty scary operation that we did. But we all survived it. We did have 1 injury. That white stuff that was all over the place, we had 1 responder that was walking across the white stuff, which was a crust, and he broke through it and started screaming. It was extracted from the white stuff. And what the white stuff wound up being was, on the original paperwork, it said PETPRD, petroleum product. It was petroleum wax. The wax had been blown out of the tank cars containing it, had solidified on the surface, but was still molten underneath. When that responder broke through, the wax went up inside of his protective clothing and down into his boots and burned his legs. Here's a close-up of that damage on the end of that tank car. Why didn't it fail? Because it didn't. Because it didn't, we could share these pictures and say that nobody died that day. I hope this gives you a little insight on what it takes to respond to a derailment involving hazardous materials. I'd like to thank the Southern Pacific Railroad, the gentleman from the Southern Pacific that helped us teach everybody how to be good responders, that built us the train derailment out at Camp San Luis Obispo. Most of those people then went to work for the Union Pacific, and like me, they're all retired now. Thanks for your attention, and have a safe day.